I was clinically dead for 9 minutes, and what Jesus showed me about the future of Israel made my soul tremble. He looked into my eyes and told me, "Harold, tell them the third temple is no longer just a dream of rabbis. It is now a project of kings, and it is the final countdown." In that moment, I saw the actual blueprints held by world leaders, the secret funding already secured, and the shadow of the Great Tribulation falling over Jerusalem. This isn't a distant religious hope anymore. It is a political reality moving behind closed doors, and it means the clock is about to strike midnight for everyone. I stood outside of time and saw things no human should know. To understand the weight of this, you need to know who I am. My name is Harold Meyerstein. I am 93 years old, a retired accountant from Manhattan who spent 40 years dealing only with cold facts and balance sheets. I am the son of Polish immigrants who fled the Nazis, and I never cared for religious fantasies. I lived a quiet life in Queens until the night my heart stopped while watching news of missiles over Tel Aviv. For 9 minutes, my body was a cold shell, but I was more alive than ever. I stood in the presence of the King and saw the 5 specific events that will soon change the world forever. What Jesus revealed to me is a roadmap of what is coming for my people and the nations. He showed me things that are already happening in secret, from the sudden isolation of Israel to the divine protection over the holy city. You must hear this because the end is closer than anyone imagines. Before I continue, I want to ask you, do you believe we are the generation that will see the third temple? Please tell me in the comments below. I hope you join this community by subscribing and turning on notifications, as these truths need to reach every ear. What I saw next regarding the coming events in Tel Aviv made my blood run cold. Before that night in Queens, my life was measured in rows and columns. I spent 40 years as an accountant in Manhattan, a man of cold facts who believed only what could be audited and verified. My parents fled Poland in 1933, carrying a silence that taught me the world was a dangerous place where numbers were the only truth you could trust. I lived for logic, raising my family and eventually growing old with my grandson David in a small apartment filled with the smell of old books and history. I was a man of the earth, watching the news of my homeland from a distance, never expecting that the flicker of a television screen would be the last thing my physical eyes would ever truly process. The television was broadcasting images of Iranian missiles streaking across the night sky over Tel Aviv, and suddenly the sirens on the screen weren't just coming from the speakers. A sharp rhythmic ringing started in my ears, and my chest felt like a mountain of lead had been dropped directly onto my ribs. I tried to gasp to call out for David in the next room, but my lungs were as empty as a bankrupt account. The blue light of the news report began to pulse and blur, turning the walls of my living room into a dizzying swirl of shadows and static. I felt my grip on the recliner slip, and then the crushing weight simply stopped as the world went silent. There was a sudden jarring snap like a tether being cut, and I found myself hovering near the ceiling, looking down at the top of my own head. I saw an old man slumped over, his skin turning a waxy gray color that I recognized from too many funerals. David burst into the room, his face a mask of pure terror, screaming my name as he fumbled with his phone to dial 911. I watched the paramedics arrive with their heavy bags and flashing lights, and later, the doctors would tell me that my heart remained still for exactly 9 minutes. In those moments, my body was nothing more than a cold shell, yet I felt more vibrant and awake than I had in nearly a century. The frantic noise of the paramedics and the desperate cries of my grandson began to dim, as if someone was slowly turning down the volume on the world. The walls of my Queens apartment didn't just fade, they dissolved into a light so dense and heavy it felt like I was being submerged in liquid gold. I wasn't walking or flying, but I felt a magnetic force, an irresistible pull drawing me toward a horizon that didn't exist in the physical realm. The hospital, the missiles, and the 93 years of my life vanished into the background as I was pulled toward a presence that radiated more authority than any king on earth. I was about to stand before the one who held the blueprints of time itself. The frantic sounds of the paramedics and David's desperate voice didn't just fade. They were swallowed by a silence so heavy and peaceful it felt like velvet. My Queens apartment dissolved into a light so dense and warm that it felt like I was being submerged in liquid gold. This wasn't a cold, clinical brightness. It was a living light that had a specific temperature and a heartbeat. For the first time in 93 years, every ache in my tired joints and the crushing weight on my chest simply vanished. I wasn't walking or floating, yet I was moving with an irresistible purpose toward a horizon that felt more real than any ground I had ever walked on. Then he stood there, and every image I had ever seen in the art galleries of Manhattan was instantly proven wrong. He didn't have the pale skin or the soft blue eyes of the European paintings my neighbors kept on their walls. He was a son of Abraham, a true Judean, with skin the color of burnished bronze and eyes like deep, ancient wells of wisdom. His presence carried a weight of authority that no ledger or balance sheet could ever measure. I couldn't remain standing. My knees hit the floor of that light as a sob tore through my chest, a sudden shocking recognition of the king my people had been waiting for all along. "Harold," he said, and hearing my name in his voice felt like every broken piece of my family's history was being mended at once. He didn't speak with a human mouth, but his words echoed in the very marrow of my 93-year-old bones. He reached out a hand that bore the marks of a sacrifice I was only beginning to understand and told me he had a message for the world that only I could carry back. He promised to pull back the curtain on the future of Israel and show me the 5 specific events that are already in motion. I knew then that what he was about to reveal would change everything I believed about the end. Jesus waved his hand, and the space of light transformed into a living map that stretched across the horizon. I saw the Middle East, but it wasn't a static drawing. It was a vibrating reality where I could smell the salt of the sea and hear the hum of engines. My eyes, sharpened by decades of auditing complex systems, focused on a tiny sliver of blue water, the Strait of Hormuz. Suddenly I saw a massive invisible hand snap that neck of water shut like a gate being locked. A fleet of tankers sat motionless, trapped in a silent panic that rippled through every stock exchange in the world. I felt the global temperature shift as nations that once pretended to be friends with Israel suddenly bared their teeth in desperation for the oil that had stopped flowing. I looked at Jesus, my heart hammering against the ribs of my spiritual body. "Why are they turning on us?" I asked, my voice trembling with the memory of my parents' stories from Poland. He didn't look away. His gaze held a sorrow that spanned centuries. "Harold," he said, "when the belly is empty and the lamps go dark, the masks of diplomacy fall away to reveal the stone beneath." He showed me that this isolation was a divine sieve, separating those who stood for truth from those who lived for convenience. He whispered, "Remember what was written in Zechariah. I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will surely hurt themselves." I realized then that Israel's loneliness wasn't a mistake. It was a terrifying prophetic necessity. The vision shifted with a violent suddenness, and I was looking down at the coastline of my homeland. I saw Haifa and Tel Aviv, cities I had visited as a younger man, but they were shrouded in a rain of fire that made the night sky scream. I saw trails of smoke and heard the distant rhythmic thud of explosions that felt like a pulse of pure chaos. But then he pointed his finger toward the Judean hills, toward Jerusalem. A barrage of missiles was streaking toward the Golden City, yet as they crossed an invisible line in the atmosphere, they simply vanished. They didn't explode or hit the ground. They dissolved into the air like sugar in hot water, leaving the ancient stones untouched and silent under the stars. I stood in awe, trying to find a logical explanation for what my accountant's mind couldn't compute. "Is it the Iron Dome?" I whispered, searching for a technological answer to the miracle I was witnessing. Jesus shook his head, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. "The generals talk of steel and radar," he told me, "but I am the shield of Zion, and no weapon forged by man is permitted to cross the boundary I have drawn around this mountain." He was showing me that Jerusalem isn't preserved by human ingenuity, but by a legal decree of the heavens that overrides the laws of physics. It was the living fulfillment of Zechariah 12:8, where the Lord defends the inhabitants of the city with a power no army can match. As I processed the sight of an untouched Jerusalem standing amidst a world on fire, I felt a new kind of weight settling over me. These first revelations were already enough to overturn every geopolitical analysis I had ever read in the papers back in Queens. But as I looked back at Jesus, the expression on his face changed from a protective shield to something far more solemn and urgent. He moved his hand again, and the map of the world began to dissolve into a scene that was much more personal and much more shocking. "That was just the beginning, Harold," he whispered, and what he showed me next about the very hearts of my people made me fall to my knees in total shock. I stood there, still processing the sight of an untouched Jerusalem amidst the smoke of the world, when the scene shifted again. Suddenly I saw thousands of faces, men and women in Paris, London, and even right back in my own neighborhood in Queens. They were packing bags in the middle of the night, driven by a burning, inexplicable urgency that defied all logic. I saw wealthy families leaving behind mansions and successful businesses, not out of fear of a war, but because a call was vibrating in their very DNA. It was a massive, silent exodus, a supernatural homing instinct that was pulling my people from every corner of the earth back to the ancient soil of our ancestors. I looked at Jesus, my mind trying to reconcile this mass movement with the comfortable lives these people were abandoning. "Why now?" I asked him. "Why are they leaving everything they worked for?" He placed a hand on my shoulder, and his voice carried the weight of a father calling his children home for dinner. "Harold," he said, "the spirit of the exile is dying because I am whistling for them. They are feeling the wind of the Spirit blowing from the east, and no amount of gold can keep them in a land that is no longer theirs. He reminded me that this was the fulfillment of Ezekiel's promise to gather us from all countries. Then the vision took a turn that made my accountant's heart stop all over again. I wasn't looking at a desert anymore, but into a high-tech boardroom filled with men in expensive suits. These weren't just religious rabbis. They were secular politicians and international financiers staring at a digital 3D model of a building on the Temple Mount. Jesus told me, "Watch closely, Harold. For the first time since the Romans burned the gates, the temple is no longer just a dream of rabbis. It is now a project of kings." He warned me that this is the final sign. For when the sacrifice is restored, the abomination that causes desolation is standing at the door. But the final vision was the one that broke me completely, stripping away every bit of my professional composure. I saw the entire nation of Israel, from the young soldiers in the Galilee to the old men in the streets of Mea Shearim, falling to their knees at the exact same moment. It wasn't triggered by a sermon, but by a collective earth-shaking sob that seemed to tear the very sky open. They were looking at him, the same Jesus standing right next to me in that golden light. The veil that had covered my people's eyes for 2,000 years simply dissolved, and they saw the marks in his hands and the truth of who he really is. I fell to my knees, the tears streaming down my 93-year-old face as I watched my brothers and sisters weep as if they had lost an only son. The grief was so thick I could almost taste it, yet it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen because it was the grief of a long-lost child finally recognizing his father. I tried to speak, to tell Jesus I was sorry for the years I spent ignoring him, but he just knelt beside me and whispered, "They will finally know me, Harold, not through the arguments of men, but through their own mourning." It was a literal fulfillment of the ancient prophecy from the book of Zechariah. Jesus stood up and the intensity of the light began to change, signaling that my time in this holy place was drawing to a close. He looked at me with a finality that made me realize my 9 minutes of clinical death were a commissioned assignment. "Harold, go back," he told me, his voice echoing with the authority of the King of Kings. "Tell them the time of the maybe is over. Tell them the king is at the gates and the clock has reached its final hour." I felt a sudden violent pull, a jolt of agony as the hospital equipment fought to drag my soul back into my cold, 93-year-old body for one last mission. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, the weight anchoring me to a truth I wasn't ready to carry alone. "Harold, go back," he said, his voice a command wrapped in infinite tenderness. I actually resisted. I didn't want to leave that golden light for a world of shadows and aching bones. "Please, let me stay," I pleaded, but he looked at me with a firmness that brooked no argument. "The time of the maybe is over. Tell them the king is at the gates." Suddenly the light shattered. I was slammed back into my 93-year-old body with a brutal electric jolt. The warmth was replaced by the sterile sting of hospital air. I opened my eyes to David, sobbing, "Grandpa, you're back." "I am telling you this because I have seen the ledger of the future and the accounts are being settled. From the closing of the Strait of Hormuz to the divine shield that will keep Jerusalem standing while the world burns, these are not guesses. I saw the bags being packed for an aliyah that defies logic and the blueprints for a third temple that has moved from a rabbi's prayer to a national budget. Most importantly, I saw the moment my people will finally see Yeshua and weep with a recognition that heals the world. I didn't want to tell this story, but the urgency I felt in his presence won't let me stay silent while the clock strikes 12. If you are watching this and you feel a gnawing fear about the headlines or confusion about where the world is heading, listen to what he told me. This isn't a political game, it's a divine appointment. For those of you who feel lost or think you've missed your chance, his message was clear. Look at the clouds, not the news. The events in Israel are the countdown for the entire planet. He wants you to understand that the shield over Jerusalem is the same shield he offers to your heart today. Don't wait for the lament to begin. Seek the king while his hand is still extended because the boundary has already been drawn. I was sent back for you, so please do not let this message stop here. If this testimony has stirred your soul, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss these truths. Give this video a like to help it reach those searching for hope. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the third temple is a project of kings in our lifetime? Share this with someone who needs to hear that the king is at the door. Remember, Israel is the clock, and the hour is much later than you think.